we will have the lecture by Dr. Gillian Glaes, followed by questions. So please post your questions on the chat Q&A that you see at the bottom of the screen. We will turn to your questions once the lecture is ended. And we really look forward to the exchange of your questions and furthering, deepening the lecture that Dr. Glaes has given us. Now, Dr. Gillian Glaes, I am so delighted to have her here as our first speaker of this series. Dr. Gillian Glaes is a dear colleague, and many of us know her from her time here at Carroll College. She taught history here for 8 years, between 2006 and 2014, before she headed over to the University of Montana. Dr. Gillian Glaes earned her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in modern European history. She now serves as the University of Montana Humanities Institute and is Associate Director of the Franke Global Leadership Initiative. She has also worked as a visiting professor in history and African American studies there. She has taught widely in modern European, African, and global history, including courses on World War II, the Holocaust, comparative genocide, European ideologies, migration and refugees, and Cold War. Although we would like these topics to belong to the past of our history, unfortunately, they continue to resonate with the contemporary world. And in many ways, we find ourselves retracing some of these events because they might provide some light to understand our present. Her most recent publication is the book that you see here, African Political Activism in Post-Colonial France, State Surveillance and Social Welfare, which was published in 2018 with Routledge. And it is a rich and very interesting book. Before turning it over to Dr. Gillian Glaes, I just want to thank her for being here. I am very grateful for accepting this invitation. And also, it will be another moment of revisiting our teaching together, which we did when you were teaching history at Carroll College, our course on 20th century ideologies and theory and practice, which was a rather demanding, but very, very involving course. And I'm grateful for that experience as well. So the floor is yours, Dr. Gillian Glaes. The title of the lecture is Solidarity and Immigration, an Exploration of Possibilities.
Well, thank you so much, John and Elvira. It was such an honor to be here virtually at Carroll College tonight. I want to thank you both for inviting me. One of my very first memories at Carroll is of John Reese in the faculty lounge. And I remember he took the time to talk to me as a new faculty member when I was so overwhelmed and so unsure of myself. And I just remember this very pleasant conversation we had about St. Louis and how kind he was, and I really appreciate that. And I also remember Elvira being in the same incoming faculty class as me. And I remember the first time I met her, I thought, I really want to be friends with this person. And I was so lucky in that we became dear friends. She's still one of my closest friends. I'm so grateful for your friendship, Elvira. And I'm so grateful for this invitation tonight to speak about these important issues. So thank you to both of you, not only for inviting me tonight, but also for your many years of wonderful friendship. I'd also like to thank the Annette Moran Center for hosting tonight's lecture. I have very fond memories of Annette Moran. She passed away at the end of my first year at Carroll. And I remember her approaching me and asking if I could take over with a colleague, Charlotte Jones, this faculty colloquium that she had that she had organized and put her heart and soul into. And I remember being so honored by that and taking it so seriously for the remaining 7 years that I was at Carroll. And I'm so happy to know that it's continuing today. And so that series is a great way to honor her, as is the Annette Moran Center. And I'm just really grateful that I had a very short amount of time with her while she was still there. I spent 8 years at Carroll and I learned so much. But when I think back on that time, as you can kind of pick up on here, I'm really struck by and grateful for the incredible friends that I made and what they've contributed to my life. So thank you for that time and for all of the important memories that I have there. What I'm doing today at U of M would not have been possible had it not been for my time at Carroll. So I'm really grateful. So what I'd like to do now is share my screen if I can make that happen. And I can. I'm just going to do a couple things. Tonight, let's see. Of course, it's not playing correctly. Let's try this one more time. Sorry, everyone. All right, there we go, we got it. Tonight, my presentation, as John and Elvira mentioned, is Solidarity and Immigration, an exploration of possibilities. And I first wanted to begin with a clip. So I'm going to play about 50 seconds of this clip to think a little bit about anti-immigrant rhetoric, and then
this morning, the Trump administration says it will eventually reunite the roughly 2,000 migrant children who remain separated from their families, stressing all the kids have been accounted for. It comes as President Trump is ramping up his anti-immigration rhetoric, calling America's system a mockery and describing undocumented immigrants as invaders. This morning, President Trump is calling for a new hard line for dealing with undocumented immigrants. Tweeting Sunday, "We cannot allow all of these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came." But that idea fails to recognize constitutional due process, long-established case law that grants that protection to non-citizens. The president floating the theory in recent days.
I don't want judges, I want border security.
Okay.
So over the past few years, virulent anti-immigrant rhetoric has taken all sorts of forms from many different sources. Societies around the world struggle with xenophobia, political movements tap into it, and political parties, such as the National Front in France, are formed around anti-immigrant mentalities. Anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia have a long history in the United States and elsewhere, and we see examples of it politically, socially, economically, and culturally. One impact of this rhetoric is that we lose the ability to see the full picture of immigration. We don't see the nuances, we don't see the contributions that immigrants make, and we don't see the myriad ways a host society responds to immigrants. When we are focused solely on the negative aspects of immigration, we lose an understanding of the connections between host societies and immigrant communities. We don't ask big picture questions such as, why are immigrants coming in the first place? What draws them to a place? What pushes them to migrate from their home? How do they integrate once they've arrived? What mechanisms facilitate integration? What role does the host society play in the integration process? What contributions do immigrants make? And what connections do immigrants and members of a host society make? More specifically, what kinds of solidarity are shown with immigrants? In fact, there are so many ways in which host societies connect with immigrants, and so many ways that immigrants connect with host societies. And when we focus solely on the negatives, we lose sight of the contributions that immigrants make to host societies all throughout the world and in many different ways. And we also lose sight of those important connections expressed through solidarity. Those connections through the concept of solidarity are the focus of tonight's lecture, where we will investigate solidarity with immigrants from several different perspectives and look more broadly at the idea of solidarity and immigration. To do so, I would like to suggest 7 different types of solidarity in regards to immigration and with immigrants and immigrant communities. They include religious solidarity, solidarity with particular categories of immigrants, including refugees, labor solidarity, political solidarity, gender solidarity, ideological solidarity, and solidarity in the midst of a crisis, including war and natural disasters. And so here you can actually see the list and some images and an image to look at as well. So first, I'd like to look at the idea of religious solidarity. Immigrants arrive in host countries practicing many different religions. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, European immigrants to the US from Ireland and Italy were, for example, predominantly Catholic. They found support from and solidarity with Catholics in the US, and the Catholic Church provided an important network of support for newly arriving immigrants. As a result, we see the emergence of Catholic educational institutions, of which Carroll College is a proud member, not only because of struggles for acceptance endured by Catholics within the broader US society, but also because of solidarity within the religious community with immigrant groups. One of the goals of Catholic education by the 19th and early 20th centuries was to serve the poor, including educationally. Catholic schools in urban areas such as New York, founded to serve earlier waves of Catholic immigrants, have recently pivoted toward newer communities of migrants as older communities relocated and moved away. Thus, as Gerald M. Cataro writes in Immigration and Pluralism in Urban Catholic Schools, quote, thus even in the golden years of Catholic education in the United States, some mixture of Polish, German, Italian, Lithuanian, Irish, Puerto Rican, and Mexican children could be found in the same schools and in many cases in the same classes, unquote. Solidarity also provided an opportunity for integration as well as the development of a multicultural society. We also see the establishment of Catholic charities and social welfare organizations to assist immigrants from a religious perspective, including Catholic Charities in Boston, founded in 1903, after Archbishop John J. Williams observed the devastating conditions in which immigrants in Boston lived, many of whom were Catholic. We also see other examples of faith-based solidarity and support, as detailed in Victoria Palmer's article, Analyzing Cultural Proximity, Islamic Relief Worldwide and Rohingya Refugees in Bangladesh. One example of this comes from the British-based organization Islamic Relief. The organization's mission highlights its commitment to providing assistance and solidarity, quote, regardless of race, color, political affiliation, gender, or belief, and without accepting anything in return, unquote. This organization is committed to international humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, and accountability, and is a member of the Disasters and Emergency Committee, receiving funding from UN agencies, the British government, and the EU. And Islamic Relief has worked closely with the Rohingya refugee population in Bangladesh before and since the most recent refugee crisis coming out of Myanmar. And so we not only see solidarity amongst religious groups, but we also see it with particular categories of immigrants, including refugees. According to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, quote, a person is a refugee if he or she meets the following definition: owning to the well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her, it was written in the early 50s, nationality, and is unable, or owning to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable, or owning to such fear, is unwilling to return to it, unquote. The 1967 protocol then expanded this definition to refugees who fled after World War II. And so with global refugee crises in the past that were generated before and after World War II, of which I'll talk a bit about tonight, and today we see solidarity with a particular category of immigrants, namely refugees. So I first want to look at a historical example, that which comes during the interwar period and the post-war period in the US and more broadly around the world and in Europe. We see the arrival of Jewish refugees from Europe to the US during the interwar period between World War I and World War II, when they fled persecution in Nazi Germany and arrived in the US and other countries. And in the post-war period after World War II, when survivors of the Holocaust left Europe for countries including the United States, Israel, Canada, and Australia. Their homes, communities, and families were destroyed, and they were looking for opportunities to rebuild their lives. In the US, Jewish communities and organizations provided support and advocacy for Jewish refugees. During the war, they drew attention to increasing violence against Jewish communities in Europe in what became known as the Holocaust during World War II. Thus, there was solidarity with a particular type of refugee, as well as religious solidarity. Perhaps the most famous German Jewish refugee was Albert Einstein, who was known for a lot of things. He fled Germany in 1932, shortly before Hitler's rise to power. And he founded, in addition to being a brilliant physicist, what became known as the International Rescue Committee, or the IRC, one of the largest refugee resettlement agencies in the world. The IRC has also become a humanitarian organization more broadly, and it was founded in 1933, the same year that Hitler became chancellor and Nazi Germany emerged, with the specific purpose of assisting refugees. Locally, the IRC has a resettlement office in Missoula and is officially resettling refugees here, and has played a critical role in addressing refugee crises historically and today. More broadly, during the 1930s and in the midst of the Jewish refugee crisis in Germany and in Europe, members of the US Jewish community advocated for and assisted Jewish refugees in relocating to the US. One example is that of collegiate Greek organizations in the US during the 1930s, highlighted in Shira Cohen's article, Turning German Jews into Jewish Greeks. She explores the development of sororities and fraternities sponsoring college-age Jewish refugees to come to the US. They resettled into campus life in places such as the University of Missouri and joined the Greek houses that had sponsored them. One example was that of Margot Bloch from Augsburg, Germany. She lived in the Alpha Epsilon Phi sorority at the University of Missouri starting in 1937. She indicated that she, quote, found a home and was thankful, quote, to the sorority for giving me this wonderful chance. I'm learning how to act and think independently and, above all, how to act and think freely as an American citizen, unquote. She recognized that the sorority provided material assistance as well as assistance in integrating into life in the US. She was part of the German Jewish student refugee program that existed in the US by the 1930s, but was also part of a broader national effort amongst the American Jewish community and other entities to assist Jewish refugees fleeing Europe. We also see examples of solidarity with refugees fleeing amidst the contemporary global refugee crisis. And one example here in Missoula is Soft Landing Missoula, an organization founded to assist and provide support for refugees once they arrive in Missoula through things like driving classes and after-school tutoring, cooking classes, and all kinds of different endeavors. And we see other similar kinds of organizations that have emerged throughout the country, including Hello Neighbor in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we see global efforts, national efforts, and local efforts in terms of solidarity with refugees. Another category of solidarity that I would like to propose is that in terms of labor. This is another important example of solidarity with immigrants. And here we turn once again to the US in World War II. In her article, Fighting for Hemispheric Solidarity, Maggie Elmore explores the National Catholic Welfare Conference, or NCWC, which advocated for an end to employment discrimination and was focusing on building a moral economy. The NCWC worked to protect employment and economic rights of racial minorities, and in doing so, believed that it could address and end racial inequality. The NCWC worked through the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC, a federal agency that worked to address racial inequality during World War II. And Monsignor Francis Haas was appointed as FEPC's chairman in 1943 by President Roosevelt. The organization focused in part on Mexican-American leaders, emphasized their identities as Catholic and as Mexican-Americans, and linked this to advancing wartime projects. And together, the Catholic clergy and Mexican-American lay leaders formed cooperative networks to end employment discrimination while also advancing civil rights. In one of my own areas of research, we see considerable solidarity between immigrants and the host society in regards to labor migration. Overall, I have focused my research until recently on the political activism of African workers in Paris, France in the 1960s and 1970s, which was the focus of the book that Elvira shared with you. And we see several examples of solidarity with immigrant workers through housing and the creation of dormitories to house workers. They often serve specific populations, including North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, and workers from Spain and Portugal in the European context. They provided opportunities for acculturation, for language acquisition, and opportunities to meet and interact with other immigrants. Sometimes they were run by religious organizations, and sometimes they were run by the French state. One example is that of Sonacotra, which was a set of state-run dormitories, first created to house Algerian workers and then expanded to include immigrant workers from several different countries. We also see solidarity through the creation of healthcare clinics in the Paris region. During the interwar period, the Franke Muslim Hospital was founded in Paris to serve the Muslim population residing there. And in 1963, amidst decolonization, we see the opening of the Centre Médico-Social Bossuet in the 10th arrondissement or neighborhood of Paris, which provided healthcare for Black African workers living in Paris and became an important institution within the African community from its emergence in the early 1960s until its closure. We also see the extension of educational opportunities, including the establishment of tutoring services and English language classes for a variety of immigrant communities residing in Paris as a result of labor migration. In a related development, you see many French organizations focused on promoting solidarity with immigrants and providing information about migration. I have two examples here. La CIMAD is a French association of active solidarity with migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And CIMI, where I conducted some of my own research, the Center for the Study of International Migration and English, is an independent resource center for documentation on migration based in Paris, providing information for researchers and the general public on international migration and extending academic and intellectual solidarity in so many different ways. Now, another area that I wanted to explore tonight is the idea of political solidarity in the form of government initiatives. And here we return once again to World War II. In the midst of World War II, President Roosevelt's administration established the War Refugee Board on January 22nd of 1944. As explored in the book, Too Little, Too Late, the War Refugee Board and America's Response to the Holocaust, as well as in the book, Roosevelt and the Jews. On November 9th of 1943, on the 5th anniversary of Kristallnacht, which was a direct attack on Germany's Jewish population by the Nazi state, 3 congressmen, Senator Guy Gillette and Representatives Will Rogers Jr. and Joseph B. Baldwin introduced a resolution with bipartisan support to Congress, calling on President Roosevelt to create an agency that would act immediately to save the members of Europe's Jewish communities who remained alive at that time. Congress was set to vote on the resolution on January 24th of 1944, but President Roosevelt preempted the vote and established the War Refugee Board himself. It was charged with rescuing victims of enemy oppression, offering them, quote, all possible relief and assistance consistent with successful prosecution of war, unquote. Various individuals helped to influence President Roosevelt on this issue, including Secretary of State Henry Morgenthau Jr., whose father, Ambassador Henry Morgenthau Sr., had witnessed the Armenian genocide and had advocated for its victims a generation earlier. And he wrote about his experiences with the Armenian genocide in Ambassador Morgenthau's story. And the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe, headed by Peter Bergson and those who supported the issue of rescue, together with pressure from various media outlets. So you can see that there's an important precedent for political and governmental support of particular groups of immigrants, including what we now consider to be refugees. And that takes me to a much more contemporary example, that of Daca, which is an acronym that stands for Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. This represents solidarity with a particular category of immigrant different from that of a refugee. In this case, childhood arrivals. Not only was there governmental action on this issue, but it raised awareness about childhood arrivals overall, bringing this concept to the greater US and global population. It was created through an executive order in 2012 by the Obama administration. It does not provide what is called permanent lawful status to applicants, but confers important advantages to successful applicants, including a temporary suspension of deportation and authorization to work in the US. At the time of the program's creation, approximately 900,000 people residing in the US were eligible. And to qualify, applicants must meet the following criteria. They must have arrived in the US prior to age 16, have continuously resided in the US without legal status since June 15th of 2007, be less than age 31 as of June 15th, 2012, and at least 15 at the age of application, be enrolled in school, have graduated from high school, have received a GED, or be an honorably discharged veteran, and have not been convicted of any felony or multiple serious misdemeanors, and not pose a threat to national security or public safety. Now, related to the idea of DACA is temporary protected status, which is a status that, based on the situation in Ukraine, we might be hearing more about in the coming weeks and months. When civil unrest, violence, or natural disasters erupt in countries around the world, concerns arise over the ability of foreign nationals in the US from those countries to safely return. Provisions exist in the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA, to offer temporary protected status, or TPS, and other forms of relief from removal under specified circumstances, including ongoing conflict, such as civil war or other types of conflict, environmental disasters, such as an earthquake or hurricane or an epidemic, about which we all know a lot more about these days, and other extraordinary temporary conditions. The Secretary of Homeland Security has the discretion to issue TPS for periods of 6 to 18 months and can extend these periods if conditions leading to the designation of TPS do not change or do not improve. And protections include not being removable from the US and not detained by ICE or DHS, eligibility for employment authorization, and eligibility for travel authorization. Over 400,000 individuals in the US have received TPS, including by 2022 from the countries of Myanmar, El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, Nepal, Nicaragua, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen. Now what I'd like to do is move to the important topic of gender and suggest to you the idea of solidarity and gender when it comes to immigration. And to do so, I'd like to return to the issue of refugees. The case of refugees provides an important case study, as discussed by Dr. Susan Martin in her article, UNHCR Policy on Refugee Women, a 25-year retrospective. The UN General Assembly proclaimed 1976 to 1985 as the UN Decade for Women, focusing on equality and development. At the Mexico City conference that followed, little was mentioned about immigrant women or refugees. But in 1880, at the mid-decade conference in Copenhagen, we see a much greater emphasis on refugee women, emphasizing the responsibilities of states to protect and assist refugees, encouraging governments to take steps to prevent violence against refugee women, and recommending that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees establish, together with other agencies, programs to address the needs of refugee women, especially in terms of education, health, and employment. It was encouraged to the UNHCR to increase female staff at all levels and establish a position of coordinator of women's programming. In 1985, the forward-looking strategies adopted in Nairobi, Kenya, focused further on addressing the needs of refugee women, stating that, quote, the potential and capacities of refugee and displaced women should be recognized and enhanced, unquote. In October of 1985, the Executive Committee of the UNHCR adopted a resolution on the protection of refugee women. And in 1987, the committee called upon the High Commissioner to report in detail on concrete measures to be taken to address the protection of refugee women. By February of 1988, the UNHCR had established a steering committee on refugee women, charged with defining, overseeing, and coordinating a process to assess, strengthen, and reorient existing programs and policies. And in 1988, we see the emergence of a note on refugee women, highlighting the need for improved data to ensure gender-specific needs were considered and addressed. And by 1989, the Senior Coordinator for Refugee Women position was created in the UNHCR, demonstrating how much the situation had changed in just about a decade and a half. Now what I'd like to do is look at the category of ideological and suggest that there's also important solidarity that occurs from an ideological perspective before and during the Cold War, and perhaps after as well. And here I'm looking at the idea of anti-communism versus communism. So first, what I want to do is consider briefly immigrants to the Soviet Union who then adopted or had already embraced communist values. One example is that students from various locations throughout the world under colonial control prior to decolonization attended university in the USSR in the early 20th century or in Eastern Bloc countries after World War II. And the idea here was that they would actually bring revolutionary values back to their colonies or to then newly independent countries. Thus, international students coming to the Soviet Union or to Eastern Bloc countries after World War II during the Cold War were seen as a means of promoting revolution. That was the hope. By contrast, we see immigrants leaving the Eastern Bloc as explored in the work of Dr. Martin Nicola in For the Freedom of Captive European Nations, East European Exiles in the Cold War. And he presents a rather fascinating look at this idea of Eastern European exiles coming to places like the US and being seen as useful from the standpoint of checking the spread of communism and establishing democracy. So here we see people fleeing communism versus gravitating toward communism. And following World War II and the establishment of the Eastern Bloc in Europe, under the Soviet Union's influence, we see Romanians, Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, and others fleeing newly emerging communist regimes. They went to places such as France, Britain, and the United States, where there was either a reestablishment of democracy in France's case after the war, or an ongoing democratic government, as was the case in the US and Britain. This included dozens of former ministers, deputies, ambassadors, and senior government officials who were expelled by communist regimes or simply wanted to leave. And they looked to various Western governments, including the US, for a place to go. One of the first organizations we see of Free Bulgarians was actually founded in 1945 in New York, the same year that the war ended. By October of 1947, we see the founding of the Polish National Democratic Committee that was headed by the chair of the Polish exile government in Britain during World War II. In November of 1947, we see the Hungarian National Committee formed. In January of 1948, we see the emergence of the Romanian National Committee. By 1949, we see the Council of Free Czechoslovakia emerge, together with the National Committee of Albania. The US government did not want to be perceived at this point in the early Cold War period as coordinating with exiles, and didn't want them to set up governments in exile as they had done during World War II in Britain, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. The US was also trying to establish some sort of relations with Iron Curtain countries, and in doing so didn't want to be seemingly making overtures to democratic expats, but they did grant asylum to incoming Eastern European politicians. On February 11th of 1951, 202 exile representatives signed, quote, the Declaration of the Aims and Principles of Liberation, unquote, at the Central and Eastern European peoples in Philadelphia, and conveyed a desire to fight against world communism and cooperate closely. We also see the Assembly of Captive European Nations, founded in September of 1954, as well as exile organizations all around the world cooperating with them. Thus, solidarity in this case was expressed in ideological terms. And because those fleeing the Eastern Bloc were seen as politically useful from a Cold War era perspective, they were welcomed not only in the US, but also specifically by the US government. The US government supported the formation of these organizations, and they received both private and public support, and were connected very closely to organizations such as the CIA as the Cold War continued. And speaking of war, the last sort of suggestion I have in terms of solidarity is the idea of solidarity amidst a crisis, including war. So this is the final category that I'd like to talk about before I conclude. So we see people fleeing war and other catastrophes, and we're seeing that kind of solidarity right now with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Calls have gone out globally to assist Ukrainians fleeing the conflict and going to neighboring countries. The International Rescue Committee is working to support those fleeing. Calls have been made for nearby countries to receive those leaving Ukraine. And the US has pledged to take in Ukrainian asylum seekers. And this comes after the US has accepted humanitarian parolees in Afghanistan, as the US withdrew from Afghanistan in August of 2021, which was another example of solidarity with those fleeing the US withdrawal. So in terms of concluding, I would like to play two clips for you. The first is at the political governmental level, which we talked about. And here we'll hear from President Obama on the Dreamers. And the second is in the very current context of Ukraine and Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion.
Good afternoon, everybody. This morning, Secretary Napolitano announced new actions my administration will take to mend our nation's immigration policy, to make it more fair, more efficient, and more just, specifically for certain young people, sometimes called dreamers. Now, these are young people who study in our schools, they play in our neighborhoods, they're friends with our kids, they pledge allegiance to our flag. They are Americans in their heart, in their minds, in every single way but one, on paper. They were brought to this country by their parents, sometimes even as infants, and often have no idea that they're undocumented until they apply for a job or a driver's license. or a college scholarship. Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you've done everything right your entire life. Studied hard, worked hard, maybe even graduated at the top of your class, only to suddenly face the threat of deportation to a country that you know nothing about, with a language that you may not even speak. That's what gave rise to the DREAM Act. It says that if your parents brought you here as a child, you've been here for 5 years, and you're willing to go to college or serve in our military, you can one day earn your citizenship.
Tonight, a mother reunited with her children. Her husband couldn't cross the border, so he handed over their young son and daughter to a stranger who carried them out of Ukraine. At crossings up and down Ukraine's borders today, hugs and relief. It took 24 hours to get through the border, this mother of two says. Women and children finally safe with a warm meal, a place to rest. Asked if he was happy now, this little boy said no. Home, now far away from more than 100,000 Ukrainians.
UNHCR is preparing for up to 4 million people that will flee into neighboring countries.
Arriving in neighboring countries with little more than a suitcase. In Romania,
where will you stay?
find something. In Moldova, where they've built a tent city, constantly praying for Ukraine, she says. And in Hungary, these women arriving on bicycles. She says, we had to leave everything behind. You can't imagine how I feel now. Inside Ukraine, desperation. At the Kyiv train station on Friday, police fired gunshots to control the crowd. Today, trains out of the country still running. At this station in Poland tonight, they're passing food over the fence. The passengers hungry and tired after a 16-hour journey from Lviv, just 50 miles away. Some, I'm sad because I had to leave my husband at the border because they stopped him there, she told me. But as the waves of refugees keep coming, a flood of kindness, hundreds of volunteers handing out soup, offering rides and a place to stay.
This girl make a post in Facebook that she gonna go to the border and try to help Ukrainian people.
Helping them to feel safe again, at least for tonight.
So these clips show the kinds of solidarity that we've discussed tonight. Solidarity can come from a variety of sources and sometimes unexpected ones. These sources can be global or local in scope. Sources of solidarity can be religious or ethnic in nature or gender-based, or solidarity can be based on other factors, such as ideology. Whatever the source, it is important to look at the ways that a host country reaches out to immigrants, welcomes them, and assists them. We also see how large-scale organizations such as UNHCR and the IRC provide advocacy for and solidarity with specific categories of immigrants, including refugees. In the current political climate that we live in regards to xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric, those points can sometimes get lost. And so tonight I'd like to end with a quote from Pope Francis regarding immigration and solidarity. Migrants trust that they will encounter acceptance, solidarity, and help, that they will meet people who will sympathize with the distress and tragedy experienced by others, recognize the values and resources the latter have to offer, and are open to sharing humanely and materially with the needy and disadvantaged. And that quote comes October 12th of 2012 for World Day of Migrants and Refugees, the existence of which is a show of solidarity. And in this image, Pope Francis is washing migrants' feet on Holy Thursday in 2016 in a housing development on the outskirts of Rome. Thank you so much for your time tonight, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Gillian, for such a wonderful and in-depth, nuanced overview of the history of immigration. You have reminded us that it is not a recent phenomenon, and it is not only an American type of reality, but that it is a global reality, and that in many instances, in many cases, it is caused by catastrophes, as you have mentioned. I also thought that your presentation, your lecture, reminded us of the many types of forms of solidarity that perhaps we don't hear as much about, given the anti-immigrant rhetoric that is so prevailing. And with that, perhaps I will turn to the questions, and I invite everyone to post your questions on the chat about for questions. But I do have already a question here, and so I'm going to read it out to you. And the question is there a country in the world that you believe has been a leader in positive, supportive immigration in recent history?
That's a great question. Well, one of the places I think about is Germany, actually. And I know that I talked a lot tonight about the historical nature of immigration from Germany from the standpoint of refugee crises generated during the interwar period by the Nazi regime, and then after, in terms of the end of the war and essentially the collapse of most of Europe by that time. But Germany, for a lot of different reasons, has been an important leader, not only on the issue of immigration in general, but in particular amidst the most recent global refugee crisis. Germany has probably taken in, from a European standpoint, and I want to emphasize that I'm talking about Europe here, because there are other countries in the world who've taken on per capita much higher levels of refugees and asylum seekers than the United States, Canada, European countries. But if you look at the number of refugees that have been brought in, or asylum seekers in Europe, Germany is definitely a leader, and certainly has been a leader in terms of government-sponsored integration programs, emphasis on integration, emphasis on language acquisition. That's not to say that the process has been an easy one. That's not to say that it hasn't caused political consternation. We have seen a sharp rise in the public power of the extreme right in Germany, in part because of this most recent global refugee crisis. But when I think of leaders on this issue, from a European or from a Western perspective, I often do think of Germany. And then I think of other places that have had to sort of on the fly adjust to the arrival of refugees coming directly to their borders as asylum seekers. I think of Italy, for example. I think of Greece, who do not have the luxury of having the physical distance from these crises in places like Syria. And they've had to figure out how to handle a large influx of asylum seekers, how to navigate issues in regards to refugee camps, how to process through asylum requests. And that's happened not only at the national level, but then also at the EU level. And then I think most importantly, and perhaps most overlooked in this most recent refugee crisis, are the stories of the countries that border the countries that are generating the crises, that have taken in by far more asylum seekers than Western countries. And I think of Turkey, I think of Lebanon, I think of bordering countries to places like South Sudan, Rwanda, Uganda, and other places. So I think it's really important to kind of look globally at what it is that several different countries have done. And I think my ending to this answer is that in terms of third country resettlement, so the United States used to be the leader on the issue of third country resettlement. And third country resettlement is when people who have been deemed to be eligible for refugee status by the UNHCR apply to third country hosts to be permanently resettled. So when you're a refugee, you often go to a refugee camp and you apply for a formal process to be resettled in a third country, like the United States or Canada or Australia. When you're an asylum seeker, you make the very difficult decision to go directly to the country you're seeking asylum in. So they're related developments, but they're not the same. So sometimes you hear people say refugees when they mean asylum seekers and asylum seekers when they mean refugees. But the US used to be the leader internationally on third country resettlement, which meant that we've resettled more officially designated refugees than any other country in the world. Under the Trump administration, we lost that designation because our capacity to resettle formal refugees went from 110,000 in the last year of the Obama administration, set by presidential determination, October 1st of each year, to 15,000 in the last year of President Trump's administration. And so other countries like Canada have actually surpassed us in terms of this idea of third country resettlement. So there are countries that are very active in the refugee process, and yet definitely less than 5%, probably about 1% of people who have the designation of refugee worldwide will be resettled into a third country situation. And so it's something that the global community desperately needs to address. And I think the situation with the US withdrawal in August of 2021 from Afghanistan, this most recent crisis in Ukraine, and then the ongoing situation in places like Syria underscore the need to really kind of look at this global situation in terms of the growing population of displaced persons.
Thank you, Gillian. Just very much, very rich answer to that question that raises, of course, other questions possibly, but there is a follow-up question to the one that you just answered. And it goes like this: could it be that Germany has to deal with less of the problems that irregular immigration can cause in terms of adapting to a country? Countries like Greece, Italy, Turkey receive the refugees directly in a much larger volume, since they are much closer to the countries in suffering, or even share a border with them. You kind of touch on that, and I don't know if you have something to add.
Yeah, I think geographical proximity to a refugee crisis really determines, or geographical lack of proximity to a refugee crisis really determines how a nation state can respond. When you have, I guess, the luxury of physical distance, you have the opportunity to determine how it is and whether it is that you will respond, how many people you will take in, what kinds of programs you will develop. But when you have a situation like we've had on the US southern border recently, or you have the situation that we had 2015 to about 2017, 2018, 2019 for European countries like Italy and Greece, and then of course with Turkey being very close to Syria, you're on the fly trying to determine how it is that you will address the asylum seekers coming into your country. And it can be a very chaotic and very difficult process. And I think, Elvira, you made the point that I made the point that a lot of the issues that I talked about tonight, and that we see, especially when we look at the global refugee crisis, we have more people displaced than any time since World War II, and the most in human history, modern human history at least, right now with over 80 million people displaced. So you're often responding to crises like the civil war in Syria, like the broader fallout from Arab Spring, like the situation in Afghanistan in August of 2021, like the invasion of Ukraine. I can't believe I'm going to say this last week. So it can be really hard to sort of plan for. And yet, as a historian, I always look to the past for some kind of insight and instruction. And one of the things that I've told my students in my migration and refugees class and my Europe and refugees class is that, you know, we have seen that global refugee crises can be tackled and can be solved. And I think that the refugee crisis coming out of World War II itself is incredibly instructive as far as how to address a refugee crisis if you have the will, the political capital, and the resources to do so. And in one way, shape, or form, all of those different pieces are kind of missing right now in order to come up, I think, with a coherent global strategy on displacement. So yes, absolutely, to that person's question, I think that geography can play a really critical role. And then the last point I'll make about Germany versus other places is that Germany has not always had the luxury, because of its historical past, of saying no, right? As a generator of refugee crises, as a generator, certainly in the context of the Second World War, of a massive global conflict, you know, in the aftermath of that conflict, Germany's had to really reorient. And Germany has also been through its own version of a refugee crisis. One of the ways I have students think about the Berlin Wall is in response to a refugee crisis. The Berlin Wall was built to keep East Germans from going west, to keep people from leaving the country, because by the early 1960s, East Germany was facing the very real possibility of brain drain, that young people didn't want to be there anymore. So to stop and stem that tide, the Berlin Wall was built, as were, you know, fortified borders all up and down the border between East and West Germany. So the story of the Berlin Wall itself is the story of a refugee crisis. And so Germany has had a long and storied and very problematic history in regards to these issues. And so it's taken a very different tact than some of its other, than some of the other countries that we've seen in Europe.
Indeed. Thank you for that answer. And in that regard, maybe one question that rises spontaneously from what you just told us is that there is a global crisis. And now with the war in Ukraine, we'll see even that get even more critical with regard to migrants and refugees and so forth. How is it, you said, in history, we can look at the past and find examples of ways to tackle an issue that actually needs to be tackled at the global level and not simply at the national level? I mean, we talk about Europe, European Union seems to not be capable of having a policy that really tackles that question effectively. And European Union is not the only part of the world that does that. Maybe just to continue a little bit on that, but there are a couple of other questions beyond that. Can you think of or name an example of a global way of tackling such an urgent and an important issue of our time?
Right. I think that's a really important question. And I think I think a couple of different things. I think the Cold War is instructive on this. And I think it touched a little bit on the ideological solidarity, but I can expand on it. And World War II is instructive. At the end of the Second World War, as I mentioned, I'm sorry, I've been sick since like the middle of December, like it never ends. But at the end of the Second World War, the only organization in Europe that had enough capacity to deal with the refugee crisis were the Allied militaries, right? And so you have a military structure in the British military and the American military, to some extent the Soviet military in the East, that had the infrastructure, that had the resources, that had the personnel to deal with the refugee crisis that was generated by the end of that conflict. And so that's part of the reason that US military personnel staffed refugee camps. Like there was nobody else to do it. So very quickly for the British and the Americans in the West, and I'll talk more about the West than I will about the East, but in the West, the situation went from winning the war to dealing with this massive refugee crisis. But you can't deal with every refugee crisis in a military capacity, right? That was a very unique set of circumstances that led to two very powerful militaries being able to essentially take over when it came to directing the course of dealing with this refugee crisis, which wasn't solved until well into the 1950s. I mean, there were still people displaced in Europe in the 1950s, so it definitely was not solved overnight. So there is some instruction there, but it's not a perfect fit. But I think what it does show is when there is political will to solve a refugee crisis and address it, that can go a very long way, especially when it's affecting a major trading partner. I mean, the United States really started to hit the panic button by the late 1940s as Western Europe was still sort of laying in rubble. And that's the reason we see the Marshall Plan, and that's the reason we see so much emphasis on rebuilding in addition to trying to address the refugee crisis. So sometimes there's economic motivation. But then when you also look at the Cold War, especially when you look at the movement of refugees and asylum seekers and people just wanting to move from Eastern Bloc countries or communist countries or countries where there had been a recent revolution like Haiti to places like the United States, there was a lot more political will to assist them because it was seen as ideologically useful to the United States and to the West to say, oh, look at all these people fleeing communism, all these people fleeing the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc. There must be something wrong with the system for them all to be wanting to come here. So it wasn't as controversial as it would be today, or as it is today, to sort of talk about resettlement. And we're talking large numbers. We're talking hundreds of thousands of refugees in different categories, whether you're talking about Cubans, whether you're talking about people from Southeast Asia as a result of the Vietnam conflict. You're talking about large scale relocations. And then I guess the third thing I would point to is that in 1980, Congress passed an act that essentially established the US system of refugee resettlement, and it was passed unanimously with bipartisan support. And it wasn't controversial. It didn't have the kind of political, there wasn't kind of the political infighting that there is over immigration today. And we know in the US and the European side, I know a little bit better, that in the course of the 1970s into the 1980s, American and European positions on immigration changed pretty significantly, especially when it came to economic migration. And so I think it's instructive to think about that passing unanimously and to think about whether anything like that could ever happen today. So I think those are three examples I look to say it can be different if the right set of circumstances come together.
Thank you, Gillian. We have several questions here, and I'm going to ask you a couple of them together because I think they are related. One has to do with the rhetoric that you spoke about, how that rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric, has been very damaging. And the damage seems to be impossible to overcome. Do you have any thoughts about how to reframe rhetoric in the United States to be more accepting of refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers? What do you think it would take to change that? And have we seen big positive shifts like that? That is one question. The other one, which I think could be related, it's up to you to see how you see that or not. How has technology, social media changed, shaped approaches to or views of immigration, refugee crisis? So these are somewhat related, and there are a couple of other questions, but I'll let you tackle these first and then move on.
Well, thank you. Absolutely. The question of how to change immigrant rhetoric and rhetoric around immigration, I think, is such a big one. And I guess for me, as a specialist in immigration related topics for my entire academic career has been focused on this issue. Anti-immigrant rhetoric is not new. My colleague, Dr. Tobin Miller-Scherer here at U of M, gives a terrific lecture on the history of anti-immigrant rhetoric in the US. And you can see it in Europe as well. I mean, look at what happened in terms of the Third Reich and extreme right movements in the 20th century. Xenophobia underpinned them, just as anti-Semitism did, and those two are obviously very closely related. And yet, you know, after the Second World War until the 1970s and economic slowdown, that kind of rhetoric was just not something that was as acceptable, especially as we go through in the US, the civil rights movement, as we look in Europe and the recovery from the war. And then Pandora's box sort of opens back up with the economic slowdown of the 1970s, and the rest is sort of history as far as how this is woven into our political consciousness. And so I think that it takes awareness at the individual level of how it is that we're referring to immigrants. One example is illegal immigrants. There's a lot of activism around the idea that humans are not illegal. And that idea of illegal immigrants or illegal aliens has a very haunting past in reference to Jewish immigrants in the 1930s coming specifically to Britain. So I think just awareness around the vocabulary we use and the awareness that words have meaning and power, and language is incredibly powerful, is important. I think holding our leaders accountable for statements that they make, and for policies that they pursue, more importantly. You know, I'm always surprised. At heart, I was trained as a French historian, and the French have had a very hard time recognizing the history of immigration in their own history. It's something that's only come to them relatively recently, since the 1990s. Whereas in the US, we are a country of immigrants, like that's one of our key identities. And so it's also very interesting to think that a country of immigrants with this immigrant past has really struggled to figure out the place of immigrants today. So those are just some broad stroke ideas. And I think reintegrating immigration and human rights is something to keep track of. Somehow we've kind of lost the thread of talking about human rights and talking about immigration in the same sentences. And just also looking at the humanity and having empathy. It's an incredibly hard decision to leave your country and move to a new place, regardless of why you're doing it, whether you're doing it educationally, for medical reasons, for employment, because your country has been invaded, because there's dire poverty, because there's a civil war. I mean, these are all different reasons for leaving, and they put people in different categories of immigration, but they're all incredibly difficult decisions. And for some people, they can't return to their countries of origin. That is just not a possibility, which is why we have categories like asylum seekers and refugees. So I think having empathy for those stories and stopping to think about how difficult it is to make those decisions, and then also thinking about the contributions. I mean, as a specialist in immigration, I'm telling you that part of the labor shortage in the United States right now is the fact that we have not come up with a coherent immigration system. And our systems of immigration, especially under the Trump administration, were steadily attacked on all fronts. And so you take a global pandemic and you have it intersect with a challenging immigration climate, and you have a labor shortage that is impacting every sector of the economy without question. So from a practical standpoint, I think it's instructive to kind of think about these things, to think about how we can return to a place where we have a coherent economic immigration policy, and we see the value that, for example, economic immigrants add to our economy and more broadly to our society, and their importance. And then secondly, I mean, social media, that could be a whole talk. I think two things. I think on the one hand, we have a much greater awareness of what is going on in the midst of a refugee crisis, like what's happening in Ukraine, what happened in Afghanistan last summer, what is going on in places like Syria and bordering countries because of social media, because people can post, because they can tell their stories, because journalists can get a hold of them maybe a lot more easily. I think that immigrants, like other people, also find networks through social media, and they facilitate contacts with different groups because of social media. On the other hand, social media is a place where we see xenophobic and anti-Semitic and racist groups attract followers and support and disseminate their messages. So it's both a gift from the standpoint of telling stories and understanding the stories of immigration, but it's also incredibly challenging because it does also do this other thing when it comes to the groups that are most opposed to immigration and to different types of immigrant groups. So I think it's a really hard issue. I will also say that for immigrants living in different countries, social media allows them to stay in touch with their country of origin, regardless of what the situation in that country of origin is. And so I think from that standpoint, it probably makes them feel more connected to their country of origin than perhaps ever before. And so from that standpoint, I think it's really important.
Great, thank you, Gillian. Here, a couple of more questions. One is about the situation in Ukraine right now, but directed at different types of, I guess, treatment. While the Russian actions has been repudiated worldwide and the world hospitality has been applauded, it has also brought to light the stark differences in the treatment reception given to migrants and refugees from all other areas, such as Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Syria. Why are they so different? Why do you think this seems to be the case? So how they are, as you were saying, there are different categories, but also different treatments reserved. So that is one big question. But I would like to attach another one that was asking about what about climate refugees, which is yet another category of, if I may use that term, of refugees or migrants. I know these are all very good questions. They cannot be answered fully, but thank you for taking them and giving us some way of thinking about them.
Absolutely. Those are both great questions. These are all amazing questions. So thank you so much to everyone. Why are different categories of refugees treated differently? Using the Ukraine as an example. I remember back when I first started teaching at Carroll, and I don't remember what I was lecturing on. It had something to do with modern Europe, and it's something to do with Europe after World War II. And a student raised his hand and very earnestly said, with the best of intentions, I didn't know that white people could be refugees. I didn't know that white people had to flee their countries. And I thought it was a really honest moment. I thought it was a really compelling moment. And I thought it told us a lot about the Western world's conceptualization of how the world works, first of all, and the hierarchies that still exist today between developed countries and developing countries and all the countries in between. So I think there's a racial element to it. I think that every time a catastrophe comes to Europe, as a Western country ourselves, in the US, as a country with strong ties to Europe on all kinds of levels, we're sort of shocked by it. And I think it's in part because we've lived in a world where, with the exception of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, with the exception of the conflict in the former Yugoslavia across the 1990s, Europe has been a relatively peaceful continent. This is the first active invasion since the end of World War II. So we sort of had the luxury of living in this world that our grandparents didn't live in, and our great-grandparents certainly didn't live in, at least my great-grandparents and my grandparents didn't live in a world where Europe was peaceful. They lived in a world where Europe was anything but peaceful. So I think it also has to do with the historical moment that we've lived through. And then also I think, sadly, race and racism plays a huge role. And we think differently. And when I say we, I think I'm saying developed countries think differently about refugees coming from places like Ukraine than we do refugees coming from places like Syria, or from Latin America, or from sub-Saharan Africa, or from Asia. And I think that hierarchies of race and racism and xenophobia and ethnocentrism are still alive and well today. And I think they influence all kinds of conceptualizations of how people think about different parts of the world. And I think specifically when we think about Arab Spring and we think about refugees fleeing places like Syria, that intersected with a pretty profound period of anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic sentiment stemming from September 11th and subsequent terrorist attacks. So I think that there was less empathy in the world to begin with. And that then intersected with, in the US perspective, an administration that actually tried to enact a ban on Muslim immigrants. So all of that, I think, has influenced how it is that the world sees various categories of people fleeing. And we know by looking at historical groups that some groups do get priority over others when it comes to asylum seekers, when it comes to refugees. And often, depending on the circumstance, they can be white, they can be European, they can be from certain parts of the world, they can be, in the case of Cubans, from certain political places, certain places politically. So it is sort of interesting to think who it is that gets priority and who it is that gets attention and why. So that's a really important question. Secondly, climate change refugees, really important topic. The UNHCR is starting to come around in the last few years in thinking about how it is that climate change refugees can be folded into the definition of a refugee. They are not currently included, and there has been a lot of controversy over whether or not to include them. One of the hesitancies is the fear that then everybody would be deemed a climate change refugee, and how would we ever differentiate? But as the climate continues to shift and as more and more people are displaced from their homes because of climate change, this is definitely something that the international community will have to deal with. And we can think of climate change refugees. I also invite people to think about internally displaced persons when it comes to climate change. And we've seen people in the US displaced by major cataclysmic storm events that could or maybe not be related to climate change. So there are all kinds of different categories of peoples who are displaced due to dramatic natural disasters or due to climate change. And it's something that the international community, UNHCR, other organizations are going to have to start paying attention to, and already are paying attention to. But I think the international refugee regime has been slow to kind of address that issue. And my hope is that we can work something out as far as folding in climate change refugees, because the situation is only going to become more pronounced.
Thank you. And thank you on behalf of the person who asked the question about the different treatment. Thank you for such a honest and sincere answer. A couple more questions that I'm going to ask you are somewhat more personal, and they have to do with one, you mentioned that your career and research has been focused on immigration. How did you get started on that? What pulled you to this area of research? That is one question. The other one also, not maybe as personal, but local. Can you speak to how soft landing promotes integrating refugees into the community? And that perhaps is a good way also to talk about, how there are local, agencies and groups that do a great deal of assistance of refugees that perhaps we don't know as much about.
Absolutely. I'm very happy to answer both of those questions. Thank you. So my story of coming to immigration is an interesting one. I grew up in Missoula. Missoula actively resettled refugees throughout my entire childhood. They were mostly Hmong and also refugees from the former Soviet Union, including from Ukraine and Russia. I went to high school with Ukrainian and Russian refugees, as well as Hmong refugees. So it was something that was always sort of present in my life. I also went to school with a woman who immigrated here from Thailand. She became one of my best friends. I remember growing up with her mom's cooking. It was amazing. I still haven't been to Thailand, but I'd like to go. So I grew up in this small city in Montana, but I also grew up in this interesting landscape. I also grew up in a university town, and my dad was affiliated with university. So I always ended up knowing kids whose fathers and mothers would come as visiting professors to U of M, including 2 from Nigeria and 1 from Hungary during the Cold War. So it was just kind of always an interest of mine. I've always been interested in global history. I remember taking my first European history class at the University of Montana as an undergraduate and just being so captivated by it. I did a study abroad program in France and in Greece during college and decided to focus on European history for graduate school. And then I wrote a paper my very first semester in an economic history class that was really a disaster for me on a lot of levels. Like, I'm not an economic historian, even though I enjoy it. But my lifeline in that class was a paper I wrote on Polish and Italian workers in France during the 1920s and 1930s. And I was really captivated by it. And then my advisor, in kind of an unprecedented graduate school move, made me take summer school. And I was really angry about it. I did not want to take the class. I had big summer plans. He made me take it. I was like, you don't even take summer school in grad school. Like, what's happening? So I took this 4-week seminar with a faculty member from Aalborg University in Denmark, and it was focused on migration, and it changed my life. It set me on the course to study that topic for the rest of my life. And I'm so grateful for that summer school class. And from there, I just sort of focused on immigration history and, narrowed my topic. So I think a lot of it was life experience, but then also just the educational opportunities that I was grateful to have, especially early on in my career. And I happened to hit immigration history at the time when it was really getting big in the field of European history. So I got very lucky in that regard too. Secondly, in terms of Soft Landing, I would be so happy to address that quickly. I had the honor of serving on Soft Landing's board for 2 years. That was an organization that was formed in 2015 with the hopes of bringing refugees to Missoula. And in under a year, they brought the International Rescue Committee to Missoula and started resettling refugees. It's quite an extraordinary story. And I think one of the reasons why refugee resettlement has been successful in Missoula is because of Soft Landing's work. They curried a lot of favor in the community and surrounding communities for the process, did a lot of the groundwork that the IRC wasn't able to do because it's a big multinational organization. And since then have initiated a lot of really important programs for Missoula's refugee community that foster integration. The driving lessons I mentioned, they have an incredibly rich after-school tutoring program for kids and teenagers. They have opportunities for the kids to do all kinds of things around Missoula and around the state. They go skiing, they go to Glacier, they go bowling. So it gives the parents a safe place to send their kids. They have a cooking program called United We Eat, where refugee chefs prepare meals each week and Missoulians buy and eat them, and they always sell out. You can't, if you log in 25 minutes after it goes live, like it's over, like you're not getting the food, it's done. And so the organization has just done a lot to promote integration and to promote refugee resettlement to the community. So I think it's been instrumental in the success of refugee resettlement here in Missoula.
Sounds like an example that we should replicate wherever we find ourselves. Well, I think that does it as far as questions are concerned. And also in terms of time is almost 9 o'clock. We do not want to take advantage of your generous presence and in time. I also want to say that your answer to these very last questions in terms of how, as you were growing up, having classmates that were from different parts of the world opened, broadened your horizon and piqued your interest in other parts of the world is a great example of how, immigration, migrants, refugees can actually enlarge our world wherever we find ourselves in a small town in Montana. And so what a great thing to think about, right? So thank you very much for your lecture, for your insightful and in-depth answers. We We appreciate your time, and of course, we love seeing you and the time you have given us tonight, and wish you the best. I pass the word to John Reese if he wants to give a closing message to all for attending this first lecture.
Yes, we thank everyone who was here this evening, hoping to stretch how we see the world and interact in the world in a way of solidarity. We appreciate, obviously, Dr. Glaes, who spoke with us tonight, and I hope it spurs some conversations for you all as you go out forward.
Thanks,
Have
everyone.
a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.